Hi, everyone. Good morning.
So tell us a little bit about yourself next to this fire.
Yeah, this is very creative.
This is a California fireside chat.
I love it. Really excited to be here with everyone this morning. As I actually just shared with Minnie, I'm moving to Pasadena in a few weeks. I've been stuck on the west side, unfortunately, for the past 3 years, and my husband works at JPL, and so we're very excited to make his commute a little bit shorter. So Upfront Ventures, as everyone know, as most people maybe know, it's a firm based in Santa Monica. They've been around for a bit over 20 years. It's the largest SoCal-based and the oldest SoCal-based early-stage venture fund, and they've invested in over 10 funds now, and a lot of companies leading seed and Series A investments. And they have a heavy focus on Southern California. About 40% of the portfolios in SoCal, and they are generalists in what they invest. And I was at Upfront for the past 3 years, and Upfront, their model is very concentrated. So when they make an investment, they tend to take, or they target taking 20%, and they tend to take a board seat. And so through that experience, I sat on some boards and I observed a lot of board meetings. So it's really interesting as an investor because I can see the insides of a lot of different companies and a lot of different board dynamics, whether it's a young board where it's just you and the founder, or a Series A board which could have one more person in it, or a late stage board where the entire room is full. Because maybe not everyone's directors will get into this, and other people from your company, your C-level execs, you want them to come too. It's a very large room. So I thought I brainstormed with Mike that might be interesting to talk about. But before we get to that, I joined another fund a couple months ago called Persist Ventures. It's based in San Francisco, so I'm splitting my time in San Francisco and Pasadena. Southwest loves me right now. And Persist Ventures is a seed fund investing in AI and the future of work. So the way we think about the world is that if you look at all the different traditional industries, insurance, fintech, construction, manufacturing, real estate, supply chain, in 20 years, there's no way they're going to do work the same way they are doing today, because it's just too manual, it's too inefficient, and it just will not be competitive in 20 years. So we very much look in those industries and invest against the transformation, and what does that look like in the next 20 years. Over the past 2 years, so we have a fund of $140 million, and we're primarily lead or co-lead seed rounds. Over the past 2 years, we've made about 17 investments, and these are companies like a tech-enabled construction company, workflow automation for hourly workers, for the deskless workforce, a photographer marketplace, and also companies you might have heard of like Lime Bikes and Ike Robotics, an autonomous trucking company, welding robot, farming robot, security robot. So those are some examples of stuff that we look at.
And Chang, before you were a VC, you were an owner-operator, correct? Can you talk a little bit about your background in the startup world?
So before I joined the dark side, I did 2 startups. I co-founded a startup with a good friend from college, and he's still running the startup today. It's an ed tech startup based in Beijing. It's kind of like Khan Academy, but for profit and in China. And then I joined another startup as their first product manager called Minerva Project, based in San Francisco. And Minerva Project is building a tech-enabled modern university for the 21st century.
That's awesome. So one of the things that we were talking about as we were brainstorming this conversation is you've seen a lot of when investments are made, a board seat's required, and the expectation of what a board member might look like from a CEO, co-founder, founder. Can you talk a little bit about what the initial expectations are and what realities might actually be?
I think the biggest misconception when I talk to founders that are very early in the startup journey is that they think they have a board because they want them to help them, which is true. But you can have people helping your company without giving them a board seat. And because to have a board, to construct a board, to have board directors, they now have other duties and other rights Whereas if you just have them as advisors or just as friends, then they help you, but they don't actually have those rights. And in the earliest stage companies, that's what I would more advise on. Because if I would talk to a founder that's raised some angel funding and they tell me very proudly, and this happened several times the past month, that they have a board, I'm like, why do you have a board? Why do you have a board? No, and they said, I'm really good friends with these folks, and I think they can be really helpful. So I asked them to be on my board. I'm like, okay, they can be your advisors, but they do not need to be on your board because it's a totally different thing. So to step back, what is a board? A board, the primary role of a board is governance. If you think public companies boards, it is totally about governance. It's about watching out for the shareholders, and which might be investors, which private or public, and watching out for their interests and making sure that the CEO and the management team is hired by the board to run the company in the best way possible. But the primary role of the board is governance. It is not to help you, the CEO. And the other thing about the boards is once you've set up a board, once you have board directors, the board can only grow. It's hard for a board to shrink because you've already given those seats. You've already put that in your charter. It's hard to say, guys, I'm going to dissolve this. It's just a very complex conversation. So even though in the beginning you think that it's you and your two professors or advisors or just angels that you really respect and trust, in the next round, there's going to be one or two more. In the round after that, one or two more. And very quickly, you devolve into an entire room of people. That's your board meeting. And then it becomes a full-time job just to manage your board. So that's the biggest misconception. And then from a board director level, there are only two things that they can do. There are only two things. And one is they can choose to give you money or not to give you money. And the second thing, they can choose to keep you in your seat or to potentially fire you if they have the requisite votes. Everything else is cream on top. They don't have to give you advice. They don't have to help you hire. They don't have to give you customers. They don't have to do any of that. They only have two things they can do. The reality is that in the startup board, a board member does a variety of things, does all the other things, and the best way to think about your startup board is to think of them as your superpower-free interns, that you make them work for you, and they are incentivized to work for you. But we'll talk about like proper incentives later. But just remember, it's governance, and there's only two things they can do.
That's probably the most succinct definition of what a board can do I've ever heard, and I love it. So you talked a little bit about bringing on advisory boards first, consultants maybe even. When do you know it's time to actually bring on this governance, this actual board? When is it too early? How does a CEO or if a founder of a company know, okay, it's time? Is it investment? What kinds of triggers are there?
Yeah. Typically, if you're talking to me and I invest in the seed round and you have a board, that's too early. That's just a general good rule of thumb. Typically, a board if I were a founder, and I want to give everyone advice as a founder, if I were a founder, the way I think about a board is I will construct a board when I'm forced to. And typically that's the Series A. And it's because it's in the business model of the large funds that you want to lead your Series A and your Series B and Series C and so on and so forth. Their business model is to take 20% ownership probably and to take a board seat because that board seat protects their stake in the company, protects their dollar amount, protects their variety of rights because it allows them to shape your future financings, allows them to continue to put money to work at your company if it works well, but it's for their protection. It's not necessarily for yours. So you will probably want to structure or think about setting up a board when an investor approaches you and say, I will give you a big chunk of money, but I will need a board seat. And that's the point where you evaluate, do I want to set up a board? Do I want this investor to be my board member? Do I think that they're very friendly now? Do I think that they will always have my best interest in mind? They always enable me to build the best company that I can build. And that's the conversation you want to think about. And for me, the right answer tends to be around Series A. Perhaps seed is a gray area. And if you think about board, the number of people you have on your board should be an odd number because otherwise you can have a hum board. So you start with 3, then you have 5, then you have 7, then you have a full room. So the number just quickly gets untenable. You add one main investor every time, and you choose to either increase by 2 or to figure out some way for you to just keep the same number, but still allow the new investor to take a seat. Someone else has to step off, basically.
You've touched on this a little bit already, but if somebody's in a seed round or goes to a Series A and brings on the board, what are some of the pluses and minuses? So there's 2 things that they can do. Love that. What are some of the other, those can be pluses and minuses? Are there other advantages?
Yeah, there are a lot of advantages. For an investor who you really trust and you really value their opinion and their network, if they're on the board, then you have more of a reason to continue to engage them and for them to continue to help you. So it is a mechanism for that, and because they have a board seat, they do have fiduciary responsibility to the company, which means that they should do more than if they were just sitting on the sidelines. And the board is most helpful when your company is not doing so well. And every single company probably have near-death experiences, maybe several near-death experiences. And in good times, every investor wants to invest in you. Like a couple months ago, we had a company that went out to fundraise and nobody wanted to invest in them. And then we helped them a little bit, and I think they also realized through some practice how to fundraise, suddenly got 6 term sheets. And then everybody was trying to get in on the board on this round. And people like Justin Kahn, who the CEO has never talked to, it's like, oh, I want to throw an entry check in this too. So in good times, everybody wants to invest in your company. Everybody wants to be a piece of it. It's in the middling times or in the tough times or when you're just ups and downs. And it's those times that your board are the ones that's the most likely to be obligated to help you and to incentivize to help you. So those are some benefits. Some of the downsides, I think I mentioned before, which is around the governance and also just around sheer overhead. In the beginning, when you have your first board member, it's probably just you calling your investor meeting every week, probably. Oh, by the way, I made this hire. Can you, or I want to pitch this person. Can you help me practice or something? It's every week. It's very fluid and it's very flexible. It's a texting relationship. By the time you have a second investor, okay, now you got to call this person and then talk to this person, and then they are going to talk, and then they're going to come back to you, and then you group. By the time you have, I was at a C-stage company with a 5-person board, which I thought was very excessive, because at a C-stage company, then the CEO needs to have pre-meetings before every board meeting with every single person, get their concerns, and then construct a deck, and then have the board meeting, and they're probably going to talk too, and then they're reflected back to the CEO, and anything that's a little bit more difficult to discuss, it's a 3-4 way conversation. So it's board management becomes a thing. And I mean, the other downside is if you have someone on the board whose interests are not fully aligned with everyone else, or whose incentives have changed, or if you gave a board seat to a venture fund and that partner left, which happens a lot because you could be building a company for 5-7 years and that partner might only be there for 2 years. Then the fund will appoint someone else to the board, but who may not have that relationship with you, who may not be as invested in your outcome as the partner who did the investment. And all of that can create dynamics of your board meetings and your board dynamic is no longer as productive as you aspire it to be. And then you had to think about, okay, I have these 2 friends on the board, and then this guy's have to update him because he have a responsibility to, but he's not really helpful. So he's just kind of it's not a useful seat. And the other thing is we have another company that has that took in some investment from corporates, and so they want to tell a certain set of things to their financial investors and a different set of things to their corporate investors. The corporate investors, what they want to tell them is typically a subset of what they want to tell their financial investors. And so they ended up having 2 board meetings, and each of them are a half-day affair, and there's a dinner. So the board meetings that a financial investor needs to sit on is like 2 days, which is, think about the absurd level overhead around managing that dynamic.
So as you talk about the different kinds of people on the board seats, if you're going to take money, do you need to give up a board seat? How do you make that decision if taking an investment round means, yes, I'm going to give up a board seat?
If your round is a party round, and we can debate the pros and cons of that, many cons, of course, then probably you don't need to construct a board. It's a silver lining. If your round has one dominant investor and they've invested a significant amount of money and it's part of their model, and you value it with all the caveats we talked about before, then that's probably an appropriate conversation to have and for you to think about. And also think about it as it's a long-term relationship that's really hard to fire. It's really hard to get rid of someone on your cap table. It's really hard to get rid of someone on your board. And it's like you choose your spouse, you choose your co-founder in a very thoughtful way. So you should choose your board member in a very thoughtful way. You should always reference them. You should always reference them, like ask them for a full list of CEOs that they've worked with before. And they'll set up intros to talk to some of them. But then you should talk to the ones they didn't set you up with before. You probably know which are the better outcomes for them and which are the more struggling outcomes for them. You want to know how have they acted. Do they just pursue the next shiny object and forget about you? Do they still just work their butt off in order to help you succeed? Do they cash in their social capital in order for you to succeed? So you want to know all of those things before inviting on a board member. In a typical fundraise process, it's this company, they had 0 term sheets for 3 weeks, and then they had 4 term sheets in one day, and then 2 firms are like, oh wow, we need to give them term sheets too, and then the price just like all went out the window. So they were selling the CEO super hard for that entire week because it was a very, very heated process. But even then, it's really helpful. You feel like, oh, you need to sign it now. Everyone's giving you pressure, and it's a really emotionally stressful experience. He also had a wife and 2 young kids, so that did not help at all. And many knows does not help at all. He had a baby like a month before this whole process, so his wife like hated the fact that he was taking 100 calls like every single day to figure out who should he take as the lead. But even in that, it's important to do your work, because that's a relationship for the next 7 years that you're making in a week in the heat of a moment.
You have talked, it seems like the overarching concept here is the board has a responsibility and a duty to protect the investment, and the CEO is really pushing towards building the company, but they also are aligning their goals together. Can you talk about working together and what a CEO should be doing with their board to help make that relationship stronger and get the benefits that they're hoping to get that are the icing on the cake?
Yeah. As this is the case with all the companies that I work with, which is you keep your board up to date on progress, problems, and plan. Wow, that just came out 3 PPs. This is great.
Trademark.
And because they're not day-to-day thinking about your company, you want to have an easy way to keep them up to date on the progress, but you also want to, they want to help. If it's easy, if they understand how to be most helpful, they all know and have a broad network that they can tap for you, but tell them how they can be helpful. So don't just say, I'm looking for a marketing leader, or I'm looking for a product manager. Say, I'm looking for someone of this profile, and here are some profiles that I really like. Do you have anyone in your network that matches this description? Can you introduce me? Make it easy for them to know what's the most actionable way to help your business. So that, in terms of emails, once a month, it's a pretty good cadence for that type of update. For the more, I think of board meetings as a time where you could have a very valuable set of people around the table that are privy to your financial information and that are incentivized to help you succeed for higher level, more strategic discussions. You should have done the update before, where you preview the deck or you share with them updates so they should know what's going on with their business. But the more higher level questions of, do we go sell by channel, or do we sell direct? Do we buy ads, or do we invest in content strategy? Do we invest in product roadmap in sequencing product XYZ or XZY, or do we hire now in anticipation of of higher volume, but then there's a risk of higher burn, or do we not? So those are the conversations that I think a board meeting should be, that your interactions with the board should be, because that's how you can really pull up from your day-to-day business and to think about how do you level up for your next quarter.
Can you talk a little bit about a well-functioning board and a dysfunctional board, and some of the things that you've seen personally on both sides of that?
Yeah, well-functioning boards are just really pleasant and really productive, because as a board member, as an investor board member, I would feel that, there are others that are also carrying this burden or also pushing this company forward, that are accelerating this company through their network, which are very different from mine, which is why we have a very complementary board. And we see the same goals, and even though if a company might need to pivot or might need to think about their product differently, or realize they made a mishire and need to really bring on a different talent, it's still a very productive relationship. A dysfunctional board is one where the board meeting just becomes completely useless, because maybe one board member has a different perspective than other board members, or you as a CEO has a different perspective than your board members. Then the board meeting becomes a bit of a show, and you still have to have it, or you should have it. But then the more productive conversations are all that happens before, happens after, and happens in phone calls. And it is not productive because every board member have their own business model, their own business to run, and they have, if you don't create that alignment, they have no incentive to do exactly, to follow one path. And everyone has opinions on how the company should be run. And if it's chaos at the board level, then it doesn't bode well at all.
Have you seen a dysfunctional board turn into a well-functioning board?
No.
Interesting. Good to know. What's that?
How often does the board change?
Okay, yeah.
As in, you said 3, 5, 7, 9, or whatever. When you add those people, and how many people are from management? How many people when you bring on an independent board, and does that make it more functional at times?
So just to reiterate the question for the people in the back, how does the board change over time, whether you're adding people, what level of management are those people?
Yeah. So typically the first board, a 3-person board, is constructed as you, the founder. Other person may, if you have a co-founder, it's typically your co-founder, and the first investor that writes you a major check and has a significant ownership. By significant, I define minimum 10%, maybe 20%. Some funds will ask for 25%, and that's pretty aggressive, but I think it also differs by market. So that's typically your first board. If you don't have a co-founder, if you're a solo founder, then your second board seat typically is controlled by the common. And the way that's structured is, so structuring a board, you have to think through all the different corner cases of what happens in the future, because the board structure will dictate what happens in every single type of outcome and who has what rights. So if you're a solo founder, the first seat, your seat is the CEO seat. If you're no longer the CEO, you still have majority of common. Therefore, you can control the common seat. Typically, they will appoint themselves to the common seat. But if you're just a solo founder and you are the CEO, typically you will appoint someone who is a really helpful advisor, or perhaps who has a lot of customer, a Rolodex of potential customers for you as your second seat, but because you control that seat and you can reappoint that anytime. So that's a common case of change. So that's the first board. Because you control 2 of 3 seats, you control the board. The second board, or when the second investor wants to come on, then you have a decision. Do you give up that common seat and convert it into an investor seat and have that second investor come and join? Then that's construction. You control 1 seat. The 2 other investors control 2 seats. So investors as a class control the board. So this is the first scenario where they could choose to replace you, because you've now lost control. They, of course, have to agree on that, and they could have opinions and they might not agree. The other way you could do it is you could increase the board to 5, where you have your seat, your co-founder has a seat, you add an independent, and then the 2 investors have seats. That becomes a balanced board. The independent, you want some way for you and your investors to agree on this person so that they're truly independent. Typically, the independent is very likely to be an industry person that's relevant in the industry that you're working in, and it's a shared seat. So in this scenario, either side needs to sway the independent in order for any decisions that require a majority of the board. By the time you take on a third investor, I think it's very unlikely they'll allow you to increase the board to 7 and to continue for it to be independent is very unlikely. So it's by the time you take on a third investor, you will most likely have a investor-controlled board. And then your rights versus your board's rights versus your investors' rights just meaningfully changes at that point.
So much good information there. We're going to open it up to questions now. So if you've got a question, remember a question is a statement that ends with a question mark. And it's also not, so questions are going to be really good if they're about the topic and not necessarily commentary about your experience with the board, whether you were fired by a board or you brought on the wrong board member. So John, here's a microphone.
One thing you said you were going to talk about, but you didn't get to, is compensation for the board. Can you mention a little bit about that?
Board members should not be paid.
Shares?
Until you're a public company, in which case it's a job and there are market salaries and there are recruiters for just those roles. As a private company, if it's an investor board member, they should not take any compensation. You might negotiate, or they might negotiate with you to cover some of their travel expenses, especially if it's a growth stage company, in which case that's typically billable. The independent board member, though, what I think would be a good practice is you ask them to actually buy shares in the company that ensures that they are really aligned with you. Typically, they're an independent board member because they've already achieved some amount of success. So they have the financial liquidity in order to invest in the company. And you give them some advisory shares so that they're recognized for their contribution as well. You want them to be aligned with you on your cap table. And they're the ones that I would consider compensating, whereas your investor board members, they've already put the stake in your company, and they're there primarily to protect their ownership and to protect the outcome that they want.
Carrying on that subject a little further, you talked about how sometimes there's natural misalignment, say, between corporate investors and financial investors. What are some other mechanisms for creating realignment between those differing parties?
I recommend not having the corporate join your board. You only invite people on your board that you think are truly aligned. I mean, another type of misalignment could be early stage investors versus your growth stage investors. Because your angels, if you invited them to join the board, they could be very happy with the 50x on their $50,000 check. Super happy, they'd be thrilled. And if an acquisition offer comes in with $100 million, they're like, oh my God, I'm going to make $10 million off of the $50K check I wrote a year ago. Yes, sell, please. But then your growth investors that invested at the $100 million valuation, they want to see 3x, 5x multiple minimum, because that's what they underwrite to. And so that misalignment is there too, because that will impact how they help you think through your strategic decisions. So some other funds, some seed funds have gotten around this by saying, we'll join your board at seed and we'll roll off at B, which is an interesting practice. They institute it across all the portfolio companies, and it helps them too, because then they can really focus on energies on the newest investments that they've made and pass on the ones that have other capable hands around the table. So if you think through the individual business models of the investors that you have around the table, and you think through their incentives, then you can understand who is inclined to be aligned with you versus less so.
Going back to that question about the compensation, to incentivize somebody to join the board, what about giving out some shares? Because I think that's what a lot of companies, really a lot of founders have done to try to get somebody that they would like to join the board. I'm not sure if you touched upon that.
As an independent advisor, you mean?
Yeah. Well, no, as a member of the board of directors. Is that something that...
Is this person an investor?
No, No, somebody that is just being asked to join the board of directors because of their background or experience or expertise.
So that, in my mind, is the independent seat, where I will want them to buy into. I don't want to just give them free shares.
Okay. You mentioned, or you talked about the main purpose of a board of directors is governance, which is interesting because I think some companies, especially early stage companies, feel having a board of directors, and in particular a certain individual, might give the board or give the company some credibility and might facilitate or help with fundraising. Theranos comes to mind, some of the people that they have on that. Burisma, for some reason, comes to mind.
I was thinking of Theranos as well, but that board didn't help her.
It didn't help at all, yeah.
At the end.
So going back to governance versus this credibility issue and then helping to raise funds for the company and also to open up some doors for business opportunities and things along those lines. Is that a good reason to invite certain members to join the board of directors, or should the company focus solely on the governance side?
Once you invite someone to join the board, I would say invite them as advisors. You might give them advisory shares. You might have them be angels in your company and allow them to invest a small check so you can use their name. Like, for example, we have a number of companies that, or I've seen a number of companies and one in our portfolio where Eric Yuan at Zoom put in an angel check. And it's at the earliest stage companies, especially if you're competing in a very crowded space, like if you're workflow SaaS tool for co-working spaces or something, very competitive space. The one way you can seem different is by taking checks from different people who have street recognition, have street cred, and they can make introductions, they can help you, and they can help you break out from the noise.
Yeah, I'm with her. You just give advisor shares. How much do the later stage investors sort of change the board? This kind of goes back to my 3, 5, 7 question. But how much do they have in those later discussions have the ability to sort of kick off the I'm on a board with it's 2 co-founders and me. Is the Series A investor going to come and kick me off the board?
Oh, typically the Series A and seed typically not, But by the time you get to a $1 billion valuation, should the seed investor still be on the board? I've seen cases where the seed investor gets naturally switched out, and this might be. I've seen cases where it's more contentious than the cases where it's just very natural, because a seed investor is spending all the time in companies of less than 10 people, and now your company is 500 people. Just a totally different game.
So on the control of the board, you said that if you had 3 outsiders, 3 investors, and two founders, you would lose control. But isn't it also tied to if the founders still have 51% or more of the shares, it's a per shareholder vote, not just a numbers vote, absent preferences?
Yeah. So you have to be very careful about your legal docs. There are certain cases where it's a board vote and certain cases where it's a share vote. And legal docs typically start with just simple majority, above 50% of board members, above 50% of shares. By the time it gets to later stage and there's contention between investors that come in, they might change that threshold. They might make certain votes the entire board needs to consent, rare. They might make certain votes, you need 67% of shareholders need to agree. And that might be set because there are 2 investors who together own 40%, so that the 2 investors together can block a certain type of transaction. And it's laid out by every single case in your charter. So examples could be, are you allowed to take on $5 million of debt? Whose consent do you need for that approval? Is it the board consent? Is it a shareholder consent? Are you allowed to take on a new round of financing? Whose consent do you need? Typically, a board needs to consent to a new round of financing. And that's how your existing investors, if they have control of the board, can block a certain financing. Are you allowed to just sell the company? Typically, if the existing investor have control of the board, they can block a sale at a price that they don't like, or at an economic package that they don't like. So there are all sorts of these cases. Can you change your own salary? Can you all of a sudden decide to pay more? Can you dividend some of the profits to your own pocket? And all those things, once you have a board, especially if you have an investor-controlled board, those are things that you now need to seek board approval. You as a CEO report to the board. If you control the board, then it's a very easy conversation. If you don't control the board, then you need to have everyone on board.
So it seems like as an early stage company with primarily just the founders, that there's no real advantage to setting up a board outside of the founders themselves if you're not raising money, right?
If you're not raising money, why do you have a board?
There still has to be some kind of governing body to make decisions.
You as a founder makes the decisions.
Okay.
The CEO runs the day-to-day of the company. My perspective is, if I were starting a company and I haven't taken any outside investment, or maybe I've taken some angel checks where they're not professional investors, I would not have a board.
Maybe describe an advisory board versus board of directors.
Advisory boards are, I think, just a nice term, nice packaging. But it's really just advisors. So we have portfolio companies that have customer advisory boards where they recruit certain set of people that are senior in the potential customers they want to land as a way to build that relationship. But it's a marketing tactic. It's not a governance tactic. And you could choose to give them a little bit of shares in return for a scope of work that they're committed to, and preferably with vesting, because that protects your interests as well. You didn't just keep diluting yourself for someone who's really excited 1 week and then decided not to do it anymore 6 months later because they moved to Pasadena or moved to Santa Monica or just not your neighbor anymore. So you don't need to have an advisory board. You can just have advisors. But if you want to put some packaging around it, then advisory board, customer advisory board, and I don't know. You can think of a variety of ways to incentivize their engagement.
Right here in the middle.
A lot of this seems to be centered around managing bad times. What are some things that a founder can do to help manage their board through those tough times to be able, even if they don't have control, to be able to successfully navigate them?
Yeah, over-communicate and always check in because if you think from the board member's perspective, if they're not hearing about you for a month and they only see that your revenues are going down or flat or not meeting projections, they are going to think a variety of things. If you don't manage that narrative with them on, maybe it's because your head of sales, maybe they had a family emergency and they had to take some time off and you're now stepping in and therefore you're doing less of whatever it is, or maybe because you found product market fit in a small product that you didn't think was going to be the main thing, and the main thing, like yesterday I heard a story of investor invested, and 1 month later, LinkedIn gave them a cease and desist on their main product. So the revenue of that product went to zero, and they had a small product that at the time was very, very small at the time, but they needed time to build for that product. And the next round in this investment was an inside round, and that's a really tough check for the investor to write. Easy check for the investor to write is you're going up to the right, and can you put in more money? Tough check for them to write is your main product just got sued by LinkedIn. Your reason to be in business doesn't work anymore. You have a new product, it's promising, but you're way overvalued compared to the traction of your product. Are they going to continue to support you? Are they going to support you in the market, in helping you recruit, in helping you retain your employees, in helping you sign new customers, in helping you fundraise through their friends because they're tapping the social capital for it? So you have to control that narrative, and you have to check in with them even more in times where the metrics aren't straightforward to tell that story that you want to tell.
All the way in the back.
Yeah, a question about a non-profit. If you were on the board of a non-profit, have you got any experience with the salary of the CEO? Should it be very big, or should it be moderate, or what should it be?
I don't know the level of nonprofit comp. The way I think about CEO salaries in the private world, if that's helpful to talk about, is if you're not profitable yet, then and at the C stage, I've seen companies where CEOs are paying them $300K, north of $300K. That's an automatic pass, because there's in zero of these cases that I've seen work out well for the company, for investors, and for the CEO. Because if you raise like $3 million, it's like 10-month runway. So there are some benchmarks, and also in some other companies, I've seen that the CEOs actually choose for the first 2 years to compensate themselves $40K, because that's the minimum you can compensate yourself and still get health benefits and other benefits. And in that case, when you're negotiating valuation and equity, you actually have a much stronger position, because you can say, I've been paying myself in equity for the past 2 years. This is why I deserve to be still at 40%. Can you make the math work on your end, because I'm not going any lower? And so there's cash comp versus equity comp, how you think about it, and how that changes your negotiating position. That changes how you can attract financing before you have product market fit, before you have a potentially cash flow positive or potentially profitable business.
Got a question over here. Because board of directors have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders, what kind of advice would you give to individuals that are considering becoming a board of director, especially due diligence and things like along those lines? I know that there's D&O insurance, directors and officers,
yes,
and things like that. Is that necessary before you form the board and make sure that's already in place? Things along those lines, and making sure that the management team that you have, that you know them well, that they're going to not do anything that's going to mess up the company, which may bring liability to the board of directors, things like that.
Yeah. We can briefly talk about D&O insurance. So D&O insurance, it stands for directors and officer insurance. As soon as you have a board, typically the first investor that sits on the board, that's a professional investor, will ask if you've checked the box. It's the same thing as key man or key person insurance, because a director and officer insurance protects you as the officer of a company and the directors on your board against any potential lawsuits. Where as a startup, sometimes you're growing fast and you don't know if you've skirted certain rules. I mean, just yesterday, even big startups make mistakes. Just yesterday, Robinhood, if you saw, it's hilarious. So Robinhood didn't put controls around margin trading, and a guy was able to show that he put in $2,000 to invest in something, and then sold call options, got the $2,000 back, and then now he has $4,000 to invest, and then he just kept doing it until he built up a balance of over $1 million. He just bought something worth over $1 million with just $2,000. Like 500x margin trading doesn't work. I also don't think it's legal. So even big companies can move fast and break things. And should something happen, then D&O insurance really just protects you, and that's just good hygiene for boards.
Question around sort of follow up to what John was asking. If somebody's asking you to be on a board, they say, as an independent board seat, possibly, what kind of considerations should you think about as an individual being prospected to be on a board?
Yeah, if you're invited to join a board, you now have fiduciary responsibility, which is easy to do if the company is doing well and everyone's online. It's a happy story. But in a scenario where the company is not doing as well, where there's disagreement, then that might become a trickier position to be in. Where, like, for example, if a company is going through bankruptcy, then I think your responsibility changes a lot. I would recommend seeking counsel to understand your own responsibilities and see if you have any liabilities. Like and other examples are if you've laid off employees, if you've acquired a company, if you've paid your CEO or like agree to a certain set of compensation, or maybe your CEO is not happy with the board. But there's just a variety of things that can come up where you have to understand your fiduciary responsibility in those cases.
Got one more question. That'd be a last one, unless there's somebody else. Okay, I'll give you the chance.
What about information rights for investors that aren't on the board, and how do you deal with the possibility that the insiders don't want to share information and you have information rights, and have you ran into that kind of conflict, and you have a fiduciary duty to the company, so you can't necessarily share at will. You have to get the board to say, let's share stuff, and they're not doing it. Have you ran into that at all?
So you mean that you're an investor and the board and the CEO is not sharing information with you?
Yeah, and what do you do as a board member when you're the investor board member, but the company's not really giving the information they should?
So in the docs that you sign, you give away information rights to a certain class of investors. Typically, what are designated major investors get the information rights, and it's stipulated every quarter. 30 days at the end of the quarter, they have to deliver the set of things to you. So that's a legal requirement. Where major investors typically defined as investors who have invested in a certain dollar amount or have a certain number of shares, therefore a certain set of ownership. That threshold can change, but the latest set of docs that will stipulate what the company is legally required to give you. If you don't meet that threshold, if you're a small angel, they're not required to give anything actually. But assume that you do meet that threshold and they're not giving you information, then it is under contract. It could also be the case where you made an investment in a competitive company. That happens too. Like it could happen because you're a angel investor and you just invest in everything in the insurance space. And companies, they could compete. So they might not want to share information with you because they know you have a competitive investment. I think that's fair, and that's usually carved out in the docs as well. So they're doing it by the books. The other case could be you're investing in early stage companies and companies pivot. And you didn't think they were competitive before, but now they're competitive today. So now you have to just deal with an evolving situation. And as an investor, I think it's fair if they don't share with you. If it's just that they are not respecting the information rights that they've actually agreed to, I think as an investor you have very blunt instruments. Likewise, you can choose to sue them or not. Most cases, not worth it. I think it's just around building a close relationship. Oh, can we get coffee? How can I be helpful? Founders who's willing to spend time with you if they think that you can help their business, and if you can think of ways of adding value and to be a good or just be really supportive when they want to talk through something, then I think they're inclined to share with you.
One last question. So a lot of startups, early stage companies, founders, I think generally are pretty young, especially if you look up at Silicon Valley, Silicon Beach area and all that. And some of the investors, especially the financial investors that they might have joined as board of directors, tend to be older because, again, generalizing, older people tend to have a little bit more money than younger people. So what happens when the board oversteps their responsibility and starts to micromanage because they feel like they know more than what the founder is because they feel like the founder's, younger and inexperienced, and yet the founders, they're the ones with they're the jockey on the horse, so to speak.
Yeah, there's definitely overbearing board members for sure that they think they know everything about your business and you should run it in. Like they have a brilliant idea where you should buy billboards all the way down the 210, and that's the best way for you to get business. I mean, as a CEO, you should be used to that by now. You should be used to people that are well-intentioned and opinionated, giving you lots of ideas about your business. And it's your job to figure out what is the strategy that you're going to execute to, and how do you narrowly focus your business. And board members should respect that. It's usually in cases where the company is not doing as well that they get more antsy and they get more insistent, that they think you are steering the ship in the wrong way and they have the way to fix it, where this is just one of the symptoms where what I talked about before around over-communicating with your board, especially in times where the company is not tracking exactly to the plan that you told them you're tracking to, where that will help with the micromanagement. the worst is if you notice your board members getting increasingly antsy and increasingly involved, and you just like nod and say yes to everything, but then you don't actually do it, you throw it out, they're just going to get worse. The situation does not get better over time, naturally, unless you pull a rabbit out of the hat and your business suddenly becomes $1 billion business. So I think setting expectations with your board of, that's a good idea, we've considered it, and here are the reasons that we think it's not appropriate at this time, but down the road, that's a better time, and like that type of conversations would be helpful.
Chang, thank you so much for the presentation. Please give her a round of applause. The amount of information that you gave us, this is like an expert course in boards, and it's very much appreciated. Thank you for your time. Is there anything so we've got a community here in Pasadena of innovators and entrepreneurs. Is there anything that we can do to help you? You've helped us so much today.
We're in the business of funding and finding great entrepreneurs, and especially technical entrepreneurs who are building solutions for AI applied to all the traditional industries. So if you are working on something in this area where there's someone that you think really highly of that's starting something in this space, then I would love to just get coffee and chat with them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chang.